that was the reason from 2016 onwards, the sense of chaos of who's the next Tory leader, who's the Prime Minister, who's the Chancellor, do they have a clue what they're doing, how many more MPs or PMs are they going to have? That second part is the reason why they've ended up where they are now, so behind in the polls. So it's as they say in football, it's been a game of two halves. The first half, quietly okay. The second half, a bit of a mess. I think when you look back at 14 years of Conservative government, it's basically in two bits. It's pre the Brexit referendum in 2016 and then after the Brexit referendum. And before that, it was basically the years of David Cameron and George Osborne. In 2010, as a coalition government with Nick Clegg's Lib Dems, they inherited a difficult situation because there'd been the great financial crash of 2008, and that had wrecked the national balance sheet. It racked up a lot of debt and big government deficits, and they had to do something to put that right. The opposition designated it as austerity, and to some extent there was an element of that, but the fact is it didn't matter who was in power. There would have to have been a belt tightening to get the national finances back onto a level playing field, an even keel again. And by and large, the Cameron-Osborne years did that. It was years of some social progress. Gay marriage, for example, went onto the statute book. It was quite progressive in some ways. The economy was sort of chuntering along quite well, not growing too fast, but not too slow, kind of Goldilocks economy. Inflation was kind of under control. There had been some foreign adventures in Libya, which were not a great success. They pulled back from Syria. But overall, it was a period of relative stability, enough to get Mr. Cameron an overall majority in 2016, or 2015, I should say. 2015 for a bit more of the same, a bit more conservative, but nevertheless a continuation of a centre, moderate centre-right kind of government. Then came the Brexit referendum, which Mr. Cameron had agreed to in the 2015 Tory manifesto. And that changed everything because it kind of blew up the Tory Party. It was deeply divided over Brexit. And then the country voted for Brexit against Mr. Cameron's advice and Mr. Osborne's advice. And it blew up the Tory Party even more. And not only was it divided, but it became exhausted by Brexit. It went through leader after leader. And it could do nothing but Brexit. And yet, having won the Brexit referendum, the Brexiteers didn't seem to know how to achieve it or what to do after they'd got it. So you moved into a situation where David Cameron stood down, where because they'd all stabbed each other in the back, rather than a Brexiteer, you got Theresa May. She largely made a complete Horlicks of it. So then you had Boris Johnson. He won what looked like a majority for 2 terms in 2019, blew that. We then had Liz Truss for a nanosecond. It was what I like to call the cluster Truss. I'm always careful how I say that, in case I say something else, the cluster Truss. And then we ended up after that with Rishi Sunak. And in the interim, we had about 5, 6, 7 chancellors as well. And the Tories emerged from all that exhausted, all over the place, not knowing what they could do. And then the pandemic hit them sideways, just as the national finances had got back together after the great crash. The pandemic threw them all sideways again with massive deficits and massive debt. The national debt now 100% almost of GDP. And that was the reason from 2016 onwards, the sense of chaos of who's the next Tory leader, who's the Prime Minister, who's the Chancellor, do they have a clue what they're doing, how many more MPs or PMs are they going to have? That second part is the reason why they've ended up where they are now, so behind in the polls. So it's as they say in football, it's been a game of two halves. The first half, quietly okay. The second half, a bit of a mess. I think David Cameron was a solid, moderate, centre-right leader, a grown-up. Not too exciting, but a kind of decent enough leader for the country at that time. Looking back, I think history will be kinder to him than people like me probably were at the time. We then moved to Theresa May, who was totally out of her depth and should never have been Prime Minister. She was replaced by Boris Johnson, who had everything going for him. Most expensive education that the world could buy. Smart, authentic, was able to cut through to the people, to cut through to a lot of people who weren't Tories. We used to call him, he was like the Heineken candidate. He could reach places that other candidates couldn't. He won that famous victory against Jeremy Corbyn and then completely threw it away from his own indiscipline and self-indulgence and failing to grow into the job as many people had hoped, but he's never done. And then we ended up for a nanosecond with Liz Truss, who was Theresa May squared. Should never have been in the job in the first place, was never fit for it, lumbered on the country by a small group of about 150,000 Tory activists. And then we had Rishi Sunak, decent, smart, hardworking, patriot, but given what he inherited, just too much ground to make up. And also probably too much of a technocrat to cut through in the way Boris Johnson could to ordinary voters. And hence, nothing he's done has moved the dial. So it's a collection. And, looking back, although he has his many enemies, I think if they were honest, they would not realise that they didn't at the time, how lucky they were with David Cameron. Oh, I think it was the Brexit referendum, because as long as Mr. Cameron was in coalition with the Lib Dems, he knew he couldn't call a referendum because the Lib Dems wouldn't let him have one. He put the Brexit referendum into the 2015 manifesto because he didn't think that he would win an overall majority. He thought he was going to run again in coalition with Nick Clegg, then the leader of the Lib Dems, and he would stop him again having it, a referendum. But lo and behold, he won an overall majority. And he had promised a referendum, and true to his word, he gave us a referendum. And that was the watershed in these years. That defined everything that then happened since. And so that Brexit referendum, for good or ill, was the defining moment of the past 14 years. It led up to what had happened before, and it has defined and dominated everything since. It divided the governing party, and it sucked up all the bandwidth of the governing party. So they were so exhausted, they had no energy or brain power for anything else but dealing with Brexit. And you've seen that in that the advantage they've taken of Brexit has been so little, so few. And behind it all, they were terrified of Nigel Farage and UKIP. That was why David Cameron promised a referendum in 2015. People forget that UKIP had done incredibly well in the European elections. I think it was in 2014. And Cameron was worried that UKIP was going to go for his right flank. So that's why he promised the Brexit referendum. UKIP hung over that referendum. They've hung over the Tories ever since. They've been the kind of the elephant in the room, the ghost at Banco's feast. And they're still there. And the big question now is, and who would have thought this was even a possible thought, that if the Tories really lose badly on July the 4th, will they be subject to a hostile takeover by Farage and the Reform Party? I mean, that really would be unprecedented.